May 13th, 1862. 3 o'clock in the morning. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Robert Smalls stands in the darkness of the pilot house, his hand gripping the wheel of the CSS Planter, so tight his knuckles hurt. His heart is hammering against his ribs. Outside, the water is black as ink, and the moon hangs low, casting silver ripples across the harbor. He can taste salt on his lips. He can hear the gentle slap of waves against the hull. And he can feel the weight of every decision he has ever made, pressing down on this single moment. Behind him, 7 other black men wait in silence. They are enslaved, just like him. They work this ship for the Confederacy, moving weapons and ammunition to the forts that guard Charleston. They know every inch of this vessel. They know the routine. They know the signals. And tonight, they are about to steal it. Below deck, hidden in the cargo hold, 9 women and children huddle in the darkness. Robert's wife, Hannah, is down there. His 2 young children are down there. They are trying not to make a sound. One cry from a child, one creak of a board, and this whole plan collapses. One mistake and they all die. Not just die, they will be tortured first, publicly, to send a message to every other enslaved person in the South. Do not even think about it. Ahead of them, 5 Confederate forts stand between this ship and freedom. Fort Johnson, Fort Ripley, Castle Pinckney, Fort Sumter. Each one is armed with cannons that could blow the Planter to splinters in seconds. Each one is staffed with soldiers who shoot first and ask questions never. If any guard looks too closely at Robert's face, if any sentry suspects something is wrong, they are finished. Robert lifts his hand to the whistle cord. He pulls it. 2 long blasts, 1 short. The Confederate signal for safe passage. The sound echoes across the dark water. Fort Sumter looms ahead like a wall of stone and death. He can see the silhouette of cannons pointing at him. He can see the tiny glow of lanterns where guards patrol the ramparts. His entire body is screaming at him to turn back. But behind him are his wife and children. Behind him is a life of slavery that will never end unless he does something right now, in this moment, with this ship. The guard at Fort Sumter raises a lantern. He waves it slowly, clear to pass. What happened in the next 3 hours made Robert Smalls the most daring hero of the Civil War. He became a Union Navy captain. He became a millionaire. He became a 5-term congressman. He wrote laws that gave free education to every child in South Carolina, black and white. He bought the plantation house where he had been enslaved and made it his own. He stood before the United States Congress and testified that 53,000 black Americans had been murdered by white supremacist terrorists. He fought for his people until the day he died, and for more than 100 years, they erased his name from the history books. They buried his story. They made sure your teachers never taught it. They made sure you never knew that a man who looked like you, who came from nothing, who was born enslaved, pulled off one of the greatest military operations in American history, and then spent 5 decades fighting for justice. They lied to you. Everything you learned about Reconstruction was a lie. Everything you learned about black political leadership was a lie. And today, that ends. Today, you learn the truth. Today, you meet Robert Smalls. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how Robert Smalls stole a $60,000 Confederate warship and sailed it past 5 armed forts without firing a single shot. You will know how he personally convinced Abraham Lincoln to let black men join the Union Army. You will know how he became one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina and served 5 terms in Congress. You will know how he wrote the first free public education law in the entire United States. You will know how he stood up to the Ku Klux Klan survived assassination attempts and fought voter suppression for 30 years. And you will know exactly how white supremacists rewrote American history to erase him and 2,000 other black elected officials. You will know the names of the historians who did it. You will know the textbooks they wrote. You will know why your parents and grandparents never learned this in school. And you will understand why voter suppression, the wealth gap, and systemic racism exist today. This is not ancient history. This is your history. This is your stolen inheritance. And it is time to take it back. Your grandmother lived through the lies. Your grandfather was taught the lies. You were taught the lies. Right now, together, we reclaim the truth. Robert Smalls was born on April 5th, 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina. His mother's name was Lydia Polite. She was enslaved by a white family named McKee. Robert's father was never officially named, but most historians believe it was Henry McKee himself, the master of the house. That is how it worked. Enslaved women had no rights. Their bodies were not their own. Robert was born into slavery because his mother was enslaved, and that is how slavery passed from generation to generation. Not through marriage, through rape. Robert grew up working in the McKee household. Compared to the enslaved people who worked the cotton fields under the burning sun, he had it easier. He worked inside. He served meals. He cleaned. He ran errands. The McKee family treated him better than most. But make no mistake, he was still property. He could be sold at any moment. He could be beaten at any moment. He had no legal rights, no future, no freedom. When Robert turned 12 years old, Henry McKee sent him to Charleston. It was 1851. Charleston was the biggest city in South Carolina, a bustling port full of ships and sailors and merchants. McKee hired Robert out to work for other people and took the money Robert earned. That is what enslavers did. They rented out their human property and kept the wages. Robert worked on the docks. He worked on ships. And slowly, carefully, he learned everything there was to know about sailing. He learned how to tie knots. He learned how to read the wind and the tides. He learned how to steer a ship through narrow channels. He learned the layout of Charleston Harbor like the back of his hand. Every sandbar, every current, every turn. And most importantly, he learned the Confederate signals. Every time a ship passed a fort, it had to give the correct whistle signal. 2 long blasts and 1 short meant friendly vessel safe passage. If you got the signal wrong, they opened fire. Robert memorized them all. By the time he was a young man, Robert Smalls was one of the best pilots in Charleston. White ship captains trusted him to navigate their vessels through dangerous waters. He was that good. But no matter how skilled he was, no matter how much money he made for his enslaver, he was still a slave. And that meant his wife was a slave. And that meant his children were slaves. And that meant his children's children would be slaves forever, unless something changed. In 1861, the Civil War began. The Confederacy fired the first shots at Fort Sumter, right there in Charleston Harbor. The war that would tear America apart started in the very waters Robert Smalls knew better than anyone. The Confederacy needed ships to move troops and weapons. They needed skilled sailors. And so Robert Smalls found himself working on a ship called the CSS Planter. The Planter was not a warship, but it was valuable. It was a steamboat used to transport guns, ammunition, and supplies to the Confederate forts guarding Charleston. It was armed with 4 cannons. It carried secret documents, maps, and code books. If the Union got their hands on it, it would be a devastating blow to the Confederacy. And Robert Smalls worked on that ship every single day. He knew every inch of it. He knew how to operate it. He knew the routes it traveled. And slowly, an idea began to form in his mind. What if he could steal it? It sounds impossible. Steal a Confederate military vessel in the middle of a war with 5 forts, watching every move with guards and soldiers everywhere. But Robert Smalls started to notice something. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes the 3 white officers who commanded the Planter would leave the ship at night. They would go ashore to sleep in their own homes in Charleston. And when they did, only the black crew remained on board. 8 black men enslaved working for the Confederacy. 8 black men who wanted freedom more than they wanted their next breath. Robert started talking to the other men quietly, carefully. He could not risk anyone betraying him. But these men were his brothers. They worked side by side. They suffered the same chains. And when he told them his plan, every single one of them said yes. Alfred Gourdine said yes. Abraham Jackson said yes. Abraham Olston, John Small, William Morrison, Gabriel Turneau, Samuel Chisholm. All of them said yes. They knew the risk. They knew that if they failed, they would not just be killed. They would be tortured to death in front of a crowd as a warning. But they also knew that if they did nothing, they would die as slaves, and their children would die as slaves. So they chose to risk everything for a chance at freedom. The plan was simple, but terrifying. They would wait for a night when the white officers went ashore. Then they would fire up the boilers, get the ship moving, and sail it out of Charleston Harbor. They would pick up their families first. Then they would head toward the forts. Robert would wear the captain's hat and jacket. In the darkness from a distance, he would look like Captain C.J. Relia, the white commander of the Planter. He would give the correct whistle signals as they passed each fort. And if everything went perfectly, if no one looked too closely, if no one suspected anything, they might just make it past all 5 forts and reach the Union blockade ships waiting outside the harbor. If anything went wrong, they died. Robert made a pact with the other men. If it looked like they were about to be captured, they would blow up the ship. They would rather die in an explosion than go back to slavery. That is how much freedom meant to them. Death was better than chains. And then on the night of May 12th, 1862, it happened. All 3 white officers left the ship. They went to spend the night at their homes in Charleston. It was rare for all 3 to be gone at once, but that night they were. Robert and the crew looked at each other. This was it. This was the only chance they might ever get. If they waited for another opportunity, it might never come. It had to be now. Tonight. Or never. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they began. Robert and the crew moved quickly and quietly through the ship, firing up the boilers, getting the steam pressure up, preparing to move. Every sound felt too loud. Every creak of metal, every hiss of steam. Surely someone on shore would hear. Surely someone would come to investigate. But no one did. The docks were quiet. The city was asleep, and the Planter began to move. First, they had to pick up their families. That was part of the plan. They were not leaving without their wives and children. Robert had arranged for them to wait at a specific wharf, the North Atlantic Wharf, just outside the main harbor. The Planter steamed slowly through the dark water toward that spot. If anyone saw them and asked what they were doing, the whole thing would collapse before it even started. But they made it. The ship pulled up to the wharf, and 9 people came out of the shadows. Hannah Roberts' wife carrying their 2 small children. The families of the other crew members, 5 women, 3 children, 16 people total, risking everything. They climbed aboard and went straight down into the cargo hold. They had to stay hidden. If anyone saw women and children on a Confederate military vessel, it would raise immediate alarm. So they huddled together in the darkness below deck, trying not to make a sound, trying not to let the fear overwhelm them. Above them, Robert took his position in the pilot house. He put on Captain Relia's wide-brimmed straw hat. He put on the captain's long coat, and he stood the way Relia always stood, arms folded, looking straight ahead. In the dim light before dawn from a distance, he would pass. He hoped. The Planter began to move toward the forts. The first one was Fort Johnson. Robert's hands were sweating. His heart was trying to punch through his chest. He reached up and pulled the whistle cord. 2 long blasts, 1 short, the signal. The sound echoed across the water. For a few seconds that felt like hours, nothing happened. Then a guard on the fort raised a lantern and waved it. All clear. They were through. Fort Ripley was next. Same procedure. Whistle signal. Wait. Wave. Pass. Then Castle Pinckney. By now the sky was starting to lighten. Dawn was coming. That was bad. The darker it was, the harder it was for guards to see Robert's face. But there was no turning back now. Whistle. Signal. Wave. Pass. 1 more fort after this, and then Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was the most dangerous. It was the largest, the most heavily armed, the most alert. It was where the Civil War had started 1 year earlier. Every soldier there was on edge, ready for an attack. If they were going to get caught, it would be there. But first, they passed the 4th checkpoint. Still good, still moving, still alive. And then, at 4:15 in the morning, they approached Fort Sumter. This was it. This was the moment. Robert could see the massive stone walls rising out of the harbor. He could see the cannons pointing at him. He could see guards moving on the ramparts. If anyone there had any suspicion at all, if anyone thought for even a second that something was wrong, those cannons would fire. The Planter would be blown apart. Everyone on board would die. His wife, his children, his friends, everyone. Robert pulled the whistle cord. 2 long blasts, 1 short. The sound rang out across the water. He stood perfectly still, arms folded, wearing the captain's hat, looking straight ahead. Do not move. Do not flinch. Be Captain Rely. In his head, he was praying. He was praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life. Please, God. Please. Let us through. A guard on Fort Sumter raised a signal flag. He waved it slowly. Clear to pass. They did it. They made it through. All 5 forts. Not a single shot fired. Robert Smalls had just pulled off one of the most daring escapes in the history of warfare. But they were not safe yet. Now they had to get past the Confederate outer defenses and reach the Union ships. And the Union ships did not know they were coming. For all the Union Navy knew the CSS Planter was a Confederate vessel about to attack. As soon as they were out of range of Fort Sumter, Robert gave the order. Hold down the Confederate flag. Raise a white sheet. Surrender flag. They had to signal to the Union that they were not enemies. The Planter steamed toward the Union blockade line. In the early morning light, a Union warship spotted them. It was the USS Onward. The Onward's crew saw a Confederate ship approaching under a white flag. They did not know what to make of it. Was it a trick? Was it a trap? They turned their guns toward the Planter, ready to fire. Robert Smalls stepped out onto the deck where he could be seen. He took off the captain's hat. He waved his arms. He shouted across the water, "We are slaves seeking freedom. Do not shoot. Please, do not shoot." The officers on the USS Onward stared. They could not believe what they were seeing. A Confederate military ship stolen by enslaved men with families on board, surrendering to the Union. It was unbelievable. It was impossible. But it was happening right in front of them. They held their fire. They allowed the Planter to come alongside. And Robert Smalls climbed aboard the USS Onward and said the words that would become legendary. "I thought the Planter might be of some use to Uncle Abe Lincoln." The Union officers were stunned. Robert Smalls had just handed them a Confederate warship worth $60,000. In today's money, that is about $1.8 million. On board were 4 large cannons crates of ammunition, and most valuable of all, the Confederate code books and maps, showing the locations of mines and defenses throughout Charleston Harbor. This was intelligence gold. The Union now knew exactly where the Confederacy's weak points were, and they had gained all of it without losing a single man, without firing a single shot, because one enslaved man refused to accept his chains. The news spread like wildfire. Within days, every newspaper in the North was writing about Robert Smalls. He became a national hero overnight. People could not believe it. An enslaved man had outsmarted the entire Confederate military. He had stolen one of their ships right out from under their noses. He had navigated past 5 armed forts in the dark, and he had delivered his entire family to freedom. It was the kind of story that made people believe the Union could win this war. It was the kind of story that made people believe enslaved people deserved freedom. But what happened next is the part they never taught you in school. What Robert Smalls did after that escape, the laws he wrote, the battles he fought, the legacy he built, that is the part they erased. And that erasure was not an accident. It was deliberate. It was systematic. And it is time you knew why. Let me tell you what the Confederacy did when they found out. Captain C.J. Relia and the other 2 white officers who had left the ship that night were arrested. They faced a Confederate court-martial. They were humiliated, fined, and discharged from service. Their careers were ruined. The Confederacy was furious. How could enslaved men they considered property men they believed were intellectually inferior, outsmart trained military officers? It shattered their entire worldview. And so they did what they always did. They blamed the white officers for being incompetent. They increased surveillance of enslaved workers, and they put a $10,000 bounty on Robert Smalls's head. $10,000 to anyone who could capture or kill him. That is how much they wanted him dead. But Robert Smalls was not done, not even close. In May of 1862, just days after the escape, he was brought to Washington, D.C. He met with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He met with Navy officials. And then he met with President Abraham Lincoln himself. Imagine that. A man who had been enslaved just days earlier sitting in the White House, talking to the President of the United States. Robert Smalls told Lincoln something that changed the course of the war. He said, "Let black men fight. You are fighting a war to end slavery, but you will not let black men join the army. That makes no sense. We want to fight. We will fight. Let us prove ourselves." Lincoln listened. And in July of 1862, just 2 months after Smalls' escape, Congress passed the Militia Act, allowing black men to enlist in the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black men had served. They fought in every major battle. They died for a country that had enslaved them. And it started because Robert Smalls sat down with Abraham Lincoln and said, "Give us a chance." The Union Navy hired Robert Smalls as a pilot. They put him right back on the Planter, the ship he had stolen, and made him the pilot. He guided Union ships through the waters around Charleston. He used his knowledge of every sandbar, every channel, every hidden route to help the Union win battles. He was fearless. In December of 1863, during a battle, the white captain of the Planter panicked and abandoned his post. The ship was under heavy fire. The captain ran below deck and hid. The crew did not know what to do. They were going to surrender. But Robert Smalls took command. He steered the ship out of danger. He saved everyone on board. And after that, the Union made him the official captain of the Planter. He became the first black man in U.S. history to command a ship in the Navy. He served until the end of the war. He participated in 17 naval battles. 17. He was shot and shelled, nearly killed multiple times. But he kept fighting. And when the war finally ended in 1865, when slavery was finally abolished, Robert Smalls went home to Beaufort, South Carolina. He went back to the place where he had been born, into slavery. And he did something that must have felt like the sweetest justice in the world. He bought the house where he had been enslaved, the house where his mother had been enslaved. The McKee family, the people who had owned him, had fallen on hard times after the war. They could not pay their taxes. The house was put up for auction, and Robert Smalls bought it. He paid for it with money he had earned as a free man. He moved his family in. He lived there for the rest of his life. The slave became the master of the master's house. That house still stands today. It is at 511 Prince Street in Beaufort, South Carolina. It is a National Historic Landmark. You can visit it. But for more than 100 years, almost no one knew its significance. Almost no one knew the story of the man who lived there. They buried it. Robert Smalls did not stop with buying a house. He looked around at the ruins of the South after the war, and he saw an opportunity. Black people had been freed, but they had nothing. No land, no money, no education, no political power. If things did not change, fast freedom would be meaningless. So Robert Smalls decided to change things. He went into politics. In 1868, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. He was one of 87 black men elected that year. 87. Let that sink in. In 1868, 3 years after slavery ended, South Carolina had 87 black legislators. Do you know how many there are today? Nowhere near that. This was the highest point of black political power in American history, and they did not waste it. They passed laws that changed everything. Robert Smalls co-authored the South Carolina Land Commission Act. This law created a program to buy land from white plantation owners and sell it to newly freed black families at affordable prices. It was reparations. It was actual, real land-based reparations. Between 1868 and 1879, 14,000 black families in South Carolina received land. 40 acres, sometimes more. They went from being enslaved on plantations to owning the land they had worked. Think about that. 14,000 families. That is generational wealth. That is stability. That is the foundation of a future. And it happened because Robert Smalls and other black legislators made it happen. But the law Robert Smalls is most proud of, the one that changed the most lives, was the free public education law. Before the Civil War, South Carolina had no public school system. If you wanted your child educated, you paid for private school. Only rich white families could afford it. Poor whites and all black people were left out. Robert Smalls wrote a law that created the first free universal compulsory public education system in South Carolina. And it was not just the first in South Carolina. It was the first in the entire United States. Every child, black or white, rich or poor, had to go to school. And it was free. This is the system we take for granted today. It started in the South during Reconstruction, written by formerly enslaved black men. Robert Smalls gave free education to an entire generation. He also reformed the tax code, making it fairer. He reformed the criminal justice system to protect black people from being re-enslaved through convict leasing. He fought for infrastructure, for roads, for bridges, for economic development. In 4 years in the state legislature, Robert Smalls did more for South Carolina than most politicians do in a lifetime. In 1870, he was elected to the South Carolina State Senate. He served there for 4 years, continuing to fight for his people. And then, in 1874, he ran for the United States Congress, and he won. Robert Smalls, born enslaved, became a member of the United States House of Representatives. He represented South Carolina's 5th Congressional District. He would go on to serve 5 terms in Congress. 5. From 1875 to 1879, then again from 1882 to 1883, then again from 1884 to 1887. That is 10 years in Congress. 10 years fighting for civil rights, for black economic development, for justice. One of his biggest accomplishments in Congress was securing funding for a U.S. naval station at Port Royal, South Carolina. This brought jobs, money, and economic development to his district. He also pushed for the purchase of Paris Island, which became a major shipyard and is now the U.S. Marine Corps recruit depot. These were not small things. These were transformational investments in the community, and Robert Smalls made them happen. But his most powerful moments in Congress were when he stood up and told the truth. In 1884, he gave a speech on the floor of the House. He talked about the terrorism that black people in the South were facing. He said since Reconstruction times, 53,000 Negroes have been killed in the South. 53,000. That is more than the total number of American soldiers who died at the Battle of Gettysburg. That is an average of 1,700 black people murdered every single year from 1865 to 1895. That is 5 black people killed every single day for 30 years. And no one was prosecuted. No one was held accountable. It was open season on black lives. Robert Smalls listed the atrocities. Teachers lynched for teaching black children. Preachers killed for registering people to vote. Entire families burned alive in their homes. Newspapers shut down, editors murdered. He told Congress, this is happening right now, and you are doing nothing. He demanded federal intervention. He demanded justice. And Congress did nothing. They listened, they nodded, and they let the South do whatever it wanted. Because here is what was happening. White Southerners, the same people who had fought for the Confederacy, were taking power back. They called it redemption. Redemption. As if black people having rights was something they needed to be redeemed from. They used violence, intimidation, and fraud to suppress black voters. They showed up at polling places with guns. They threatened to fire black workers if they voted Republican. They stuffed ballot boxes. They threw out votes. They changed the rules. And slowly, district by district, state by state, they took power back. Robert Smalls saw it happening. He testified before Congress about it. In 1876, during an election, he watched armed white men surround a polling place and keep black voters away. He documented fraud, intimidation, and violence. He brought evidence to Congress, and still, nothing changed. In 1878, Democrats in South Carolina tried to destroy him politically. They accused him of taking a $5,000 bribe while he was in the state legislature years earlier. It was a setup. They wanted to discredit him, ruin him, and remove him from power. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. But in 1879, he was pardoned. Even the governor knew it was a political hit job, but the damage was done. His reputation was tarnished. And that is exactly what they wanted. In 1880, he lost his seat in Congress for the first time. The election was rigged. He received only 40% of the vote in a district that was overwhelmingly black. He filed a formal complaint showing evidence of voter intimidation and fraud. But nothing happened. He managed to win his seat back in 1882 and again in 1884. But every election was harder. The violence was getting worse. The fraud was getting worse. And by 1887, he was finally forced out for good. White supremacists had taken full control of South Carolina. In 1895, South Carolina held a constitutional convention. The purpose was to rewrite the state constitution in a way that would legally strip black people of the right to vote. Robert Smalls was one of only 6 black delegates at the convention. He was 66 years old. He had spent 30 years fighting, and now he was watching everything he had built being torn down. The white delegates proposed a series of measures designed to disenfranchise black voters: poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, all of it targeted at keeping black people away from the ballot box. Robert Smalls stood up and fought back. He gave speeches. He wrote articles for newspapers. He told the country what South Carolina was doing. He wanted the world to know. But it did not matter. The new Constitution passed, and within 10 years, black voter registration in South Carolina dropped from 90% to almost zero. The same thing happened across the South: Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina. Every state copied South Carolina's model, and for the next 70 years, black people in the South could not vote. They could not hold office. They could not serve on juries. They were shut out of political power completely. Everything Robert Smalls and his generation had fought for was erased. And then they erased Robert Smalls himself. Here is what they did. They rewrote history. Systematically, deliberately. With academic credentials and government approval, they erased Robert Smalls and 2,000 other black elected officials from Reconstruction from the textbooks. They made sure your grandparents never learned about them. They made sure your parents never learned about them. They made sure you never learned about them. And they did it so well that most Americans today have no idea that black men ran Southern state governments for 12 years after the Civil War. The architect of this erasure was a man named William Archibald Dunning. He was a professor at Columbia University from 1886 to 1922. He trained an entire generation of historians, and he taught them that Reconstruction was a disaster. He taught them that giving black people the right to vote was a mistake. He taught them that black politicians were corrupt, incompetent, and controlled by northern white carpetbaggers. He called it the Dunning School of Reconstruction History, and it became the standard interpretation taught in every university in America for 70 years. Here is what the Dunning School taught. They said freed slaves were not ready for freedom. They said black people lacked the intelligence and moral character to participate in democracy. They said Reconstruction governments were the most corrupt in American history. They said the Ku Klux Klan was a defensive organization protecting white Southerners from black aggression. They said the end of Reconstruction, when white Democrats violently overthrew black and Republican governments, was redemption. That is the word they used. Redemption. As if white supremacy was salvation. And here is the most insidious part. They did not just teach this in universities. They put it in textbooks. They made sure children learned it. In 1919, an organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy published a document titled A Measuring Rod to Test Textbooks. It was a checklist for censoring history books. The document said textbooks must not call slavery cruel or unjust. They must call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. They must portray Confederate soldiers as heroes. They must criticize Reconstruction. And most importantly, they must not give credit to black politicians or leaders. School districts across the South adopted these standards. If a textbook did not meet the United Daughters of the Confederacy's approval, it was banned. Publishers knew this, so they wrote textbooks that followed the guidelines. They wrote books that said slavery was not that bad. They wrote books that said Reconstruction failed because black people were not capable of governing. They wrote books that erased Robert Smalls, Hiram Revels, Blanche Bruce, PBS, Pinchback, and every other black leader who had fought for justice. Your parents went to school with those textbooks. Your grandparents went to school with those textbooks. If you went to school in the South before the 1990s, you probably used those textbooks. You were taught lies, deliberate, systematic, racist lies. And the people who taught you those lies knew they were lies. The textbook companies knew. The school boards knew. The state education departments knew. They chose lies over truth because the truth was too dangerous. The truth would have made you angry. The truth would have made you demand justice. So they buried it. Let me give you a specific example. Robert Smalls died in 1915. That is only 110 years ago. That is your great-great-grandparents' generation. When he died, he was still famous in South Carolina. Newspapers wrote obituaries. People attended his funeral. Everyone in Beaufort knew who he was. But within 20 years, he had been erased from textbooks. By the 1930s, children in South Carolina were learning about Confederate heroes and the glory of the lost cause. But they were not learning about the black man who stole a Confederate ship and became a congressman. His house in Beaufort sat there for decades, slowly deteriorating. No historic marker, no preservation effort, nothing. It was not until 1974 that the house was finally designated a National Historic Landmark. That is 59 years after Robert Smalls died. And even then, most people did not know the story. It was not until 2023 that the National Trust for Historic Preservation purchased the house to restore it and turn it into a museum. 108 years after he died. 161 years after he stole the planter. That is how long it took for the country to care. But the physical erasure was only part of it. They also destroyed the records. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, white supremacist Democrats took control of southern state governments. They burned documents. They destroyed property records. They erased evidence of black land ownership. In some counties, entire record books went missing. Deeds that proved black families owned land disappeared. Tax records vanished. And when black families could not prove they owned land, white men took it, sometimes through legal maneuvers, sometimes through outright theft, sometimes through violence. Remember those 14,000 black families in South Carolina who received land through the Land Commission. By 1920, most of them had lost it, not because they sold it, not because they failed to work it, but because the system was designed to take it away. Property taxes were increased on black-owned land. If families could not pay, the land was auctioned off. And guess who bought it? White men. For pennies on the dollar. It was legal theft. The same thing happened with voting rights. After the 1895 South Carolina Constitutional Convention, black voter registration collapsed. The new constitution required voters to pass a literacy test, pay a poll tax, and prove their grandfather had voted. That last one was called the Grandfather Clause. If your grandfather voted before 1867, you were exempt from the other requirements. But slavery did not end until 1865. So almost no black person's grandfather had voted before 1867. That was the point. It was designed to exclude black people while allowing illiterate poor whites to vote. And it worked. In 1896, South Carolina had 130,000 registered black voters. By 1900, there were 5,000. By 1940, there were 3,000. That is a 95% drop. And South Carolina was not unique. Mississippi did it first in 1890. Louisiana followed in 1898. North Carolina in 1900. Alabama and Virginia in 1901. Georgia in 1908. Every southern state copied the same playbook. And for the next 70 years, black people in the South could not vote. They could not run for office. They could not serve on juries. They were politically erased. The media helped. White-owned newspapers in the South spent decades portraying black politicians as criminals and fools. Anytime a black person was elected to anything during Reconstruction, newspapers called it Negro Rule. They made it sound like a plague. They published cartoons showing black legislators as monkeys. They wrote editorials saying black people were biologically inferior. And when white supremacists used violence to overthrow these governments, newspapers cheered. They called it redemption. They called the terrorists redeemers. They made murderers sound like heroes. Even the language was manipulated. When white mobs attacked black communities, newspapers did not call it a massacre. They called it a race riot. A riot implies both sides were fighting. A massacre is one-sided slaughter. Tulsa 1921 was not a race riot. It was a massacre. White mobs burned 35 blocks of a thriving black neighborhood, killed 300 people, and destroyed 1,200 homes. But for 75 years, it was called the Tulsa Race Riot. That was deliberate. Calling it a riot made it sound like black people shared the blame. They did not. They were victims of terrorism. The same thing happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. White supremacists staged a coup. They overthrew the legally elected biracial city government. They killed dozens of black residents. They burned black-owned businesses and newspapers. They drove 2,000 black people out of the city. And newspapers called it the Wilmington Race Riot. It was not a riot. It was a coup. It was ethnic cleansing. But they used language to hide the truth. And then there was the entertainment industry. In 1915, a film called The Birth of a Nation was released. It was directed by D.W. Griffith. It portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. It showed black men played by white actors in blackface as violent savages threatening white women. It depicted Reconstruction as a nightmare of black corruption and incompetence. And it was a massive hit. It made millions of dollars. It was shown in theaters across the country. President Woodrow Wilson screened it at the White House and reportedly said it was like writing history with lightning. The film single-handedly revived the Ku Klux Klan. Klan membership exploded after the movie came out, and an entire generation of white Americans learned a completely false version of history from that film. That is the power of media. That is the power of narrative control. If you control what people see, what they read, what they are taught in school, you control what they believe. And white supremacists controlled all of it for 100 years. They controlled the universities. They controlled the textbooks. They controlled the newspapers. They controlled Hollywood. And they used all of that power to erase Robert Smalls and everyone like him. Why does this matter now? Why does any of this matter in 2025? Because the theft never stopped. The systems they built are still here. Voter suppression, wealth inequality, mass incarceration, police brutality. These are not accidents. These are the direct descendants of the policies that destroyed Reconstruction. Let me break it down. The median white household in America today has a net worth of $188,200. The median black household has a net worth of $24,100. That is an 8-to-1 gap. White families have 8 times the wealth of black families. And people say, well, that is because black people do not work hard. That is because black people make bad decisions. That is a lie. That is racist propaganda designed to justify theft. Here is the truth. Robert Smalls and 14,000 other black families in South Carolina were given land in the 1870s. If those families had been able to keep that land and pass it down through 5 generations, their descendants would be landowners today. Land in Beaufort County, South Carolina is worth $10,000 to $50,000 per acre today. 40 acres at $20,000 per acre is $800,000. Multiply that by 14,000 families. That is $11.2 billion in stolen wealth, just in South Carolina alone. Just from land theft. That does not even count businesses' destroyed savings, stolen wages unpaid, and opportunities denied. Now multiply that across the entire South. Across every state where black people built wealth during Reconstruction and then had it taken away. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions. That wealth did not disappear. It was transferred from black families to white families. And that transfer is why the wealth gap exists today. They say slavery ended a long time ago. Reconstruction ended in 1877. That is almost 150 years ago. Why are you still complaining? Here is why. Because the theft did not stop in 1877. It continued. Redlining started in 1934 and did not end until 1968. That is only 57 years ago. Redlining was a federal government policy that labeled black neighborhoods as high risk and refused to give mortgages to black families. If you could not get a mortgage, you could not buy a house. If you could not buy a house, you could not build equity. If you could not build equity, you stayed poor. And your children stayed poor. And your grandchildren stayed poor. For 57 years, the federal government actively prevented black families from building wealth through home ownership. That is not ancient history. That is your parents' lifetime. And even after redlining ended, the damage was done. By 1968, white families had already accumulated massive amounts of home equity. They had already moved to the suburbs. They had already locked in their wealth. Black families were starting from zero. And then came mass incarceration, the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, all of it targeted at black communities. The result, black people make up 13% of the US population, but 40% of the prison population. And guess what prisoners do? They work for 10 cents to $1 per hour. That is slavery. The 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery, it just moved it to prisons. And voter suppression. It never went away, it just changed forms. In 1895, South Carolina used literacy tests and poll taxes. In 2025, states use voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, closing polling places in black neighborhoods, and limiting early voting. It is the same goal. Keep black people away from the ballot box. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down key parts of the Voting Rights Act, and immediately states that had been required to get federal approval before changing voting laws started passing restrictions. Hundreds of bills limiting voting rights have been proposed since 2020. This is what Robert Smalls warned about in 1895. And it is still happening. Gentrification is modern land theft. Historically, black neighborhoods like Beaufort, like Harlem, like Oakland, are being taken over by wealthy white developers. Property taxes go up. Long-time black residents cannot afford to stay. They are forced out. And the land their families lived on for generations goes to someone else. It is the exact same thing that happened after Reconstruction. Different methods. Same result. So when people ask, why are you still talking about the past? This is why. Because the past is not past. It is present. It is happening right now. The systems that crushed Robert Smalls are the same systems crushing you. And until we dismantle those systems, until we demand reparations for the wealth that was stolen, until we restore voting rights and end mass incarceration and stop gentrification, nothing will change. This is your stolen inheritance. 14,000 families got land. Your family might have been one of them. If they were, you should be a landowner today. You should have generational wealth. You should have equity to pass down to your children. But you do not, because it was stolen, and they convinced you it was your fault. That is the cruelest part. They stole from you, and then they told you that you were poor because you were lazy. That is a lie. You are poor because they robbed you. Your parents are poor because they were robbed. Your grandparents were poor because they were robbed. And if we do not fight back, your children will be robbed too. But here is what they could not steal. They could not steal your strength. They could not steal your intelligence. They could not steal your resilience. Robert Smalls was born enslaved. He had nothing. No money, no education, no rights. And he became a war hero, a millionaire, and a 5-term congressman. He did that. A black man did that. Your ancestor did that. Because you are descended from people who survived the Middle Passage. You are descended from people who survived slavery. You are descended from people who survived Jim Crow. You are descended from warriors. Stop letting them tell you that you come from victims. You do not. You come from survivors. You come from fighters. You come from people who built empires from nothing, and then had those empires burned down and built them again. That strength is in your DNA. That intelligence is in your DNA. That resilience is in your DNA. They tried to breed it out. They tried to beat it out. They tried to legislate it out. And they failed. You are still here. We are still here. And we are not asking for anything. We are demanding what is owed. Reparations are not a gift. They are repayment for stolen labor, stolen land, stolen lives, and stolen futures. When someone steals your car, you do not ask nicely for it back. You demand it. You call the police. You take them to court. You get your property returned. That is what reparations are. Returning stolen property. And we will not stop demanding it until we get it. You are not a victim. You are a survivor of genocide. You are a descendant of warriors. You are an heir to stolen empires. Your poverty is not your fault. It was engineered. Your struggle is not because you are weak. It is because they built a system designed to keep you down. But you are still here. You are still standing. You are still fighting. And that terrifies them. Because if you ever realize how powerful you are, if you ever realize what was taken from you, if you ever decide to take it back, nothing will stop you. God did not bring your ancestors through the Middle Passage for no reason. God did not bring them through slavery for no reason. God did not bring them through Jim Crow for no reason. You are here because you have a purpose. You are here because you have a mission. To tell the truth. To demand justice. To reclaim what was stolen. This is not random. This is not an accident. You finding this video today, learning this story today, that is divine appointment. God is waking you up. God is showing you the truth. And now that you know, you have a responsibility. You have to share it. You have to teach it. You have to make sure the next generation does not grow up on lies the way you did. If this video shook you, comment truth below. Hit that like button if you are done with the lies. Share this with someone who needs to know. Do not let them bury Robert Smalls again. Do not let them erase our history again. You are the keeper of this truth now. You have the knowledge. You have the power. Use it. Subscribe to this channel because we are exposing hundreds more stories just like this. Stories of Black excellence that were erased. Stories of Black resistance that were hidden. Stories of Black achievement that were buried. Every week we bring you another piece of your stolen history. Every week we give you another weapon in the fight for truth. Do not miss a single one. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and bring your family with you. Show this to your children. Show this to your parents. Show this to your church. Make sure everyone knows. Tell your children about Robert Smalls. Tell them about the man who stole a Confederate ship at 3 in the morning and sailed it past 5 forts. Tell them about the man who met with Abraham Lincoln and changed the course of the war. Tell them about the man who wrote the first free public education law in America. Tell them about the man who served 5 terms in Congress and fought voter suppression until his dying day. Tell them that this man looked like them. Tell them that this man came from nothing and became everything. Tell them that they carry his legacy. And tell them that no one, no system, no lie can ever take that away. Father God, we come before you with grateful hearts. We thank you for preserving this truth. We thank you for the life and legacy of Robert Smalls. We thank you for his courage on that dark morning in Charleston Harbor. We thank you for his wisdom in the halls of Congress. We thank you for his fight for justice that never wavered, never weakened, never stopped. We pray for the 14,000 families who received land and then had it stolen. We pray for the 2,000 black elected officials whose names were erased from history. We pray for the 53,000 souls who were murdered by white supremacist terrorists and never received justice. Lord, their blood cries out from the ground. Vindicate them, remember them, and give us the strength to carry on their fight. We pray for everyone watching this video. Awaken them to the truth. Break the chains of miseducation. Shatter the lies they were taught. Give them eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts brave enough to demand what is owed. Protect them as they share this truth. Strengthen them as they face resistance. Empower them as they fight for justice. Bless those who seek truth in a world full of lies. Bless those who resist erasure in a system designed to silence them. Bless those who build in a society designed to tear them down. And bless the memory of Robert Smalls and every freedom fighter who paved the way. In Jesus' name, amen. Walk in truth. Demand justice. You are free. This is Dark History Stories. Until next time, build wealth, demand reparations, and remember the theft.